Well, thank you, Dr. Simon, for being here. I really appreciate your time and your ability to talk about this kind of subject because we've never covered this before on my page. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. For everyone tuning in, please know that Rebecca is the author of Pirate Queens: The Lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and another book we're going to talk about right now, just off the top, because it goes into this one. Your first book was Why We Love Pirates: The Hunt for Captain Kidd and how he changed piracy forever. Why do we love pirates, Rebecca?
We love pirates for several reasons, but the big one is that they kind of represent a freedom that people might not have been able to have before otherwise. So during the early modern period, the social lives were very fixed. There was very little to no social mobility at all whatsoever. You're born poor, you stay poor, your grandchildren will be poor, etc. But pirates, most of whom were from poor backgrounds, if they were lucky, they could amass quite a bit of wealth. And people did find this really interesting because they kind of symbolized this and they worked for themselves completely. And again, this was very interesting. And during times of political upheaval, they were able to bring in black market goods into different colonial areas that had a lot of trade restrictions. And so the colonists and governors actually supported pirates for a long period of time. Over time, pirates kind of devolved into almost mythical beings in a way. And this was really pushed forward with Robert Louis Stevenson's book, Treasure Island, kind of building on an idea of buried treasure from pirates and creating a big swashbuckling adventure. And people have always been attracted to adventure stories. And, we always think our lives are a bit mundane. And so we get attracted to an idea of something exciting and unpredictable happening. And this book really altered our entire perception of what piracy was in terms of burying treasure, the pirate language and slang, how pirates looked and everything like that. So virtually every single thing that we know about pirates, unless you've studied piracy extensively, probably is coming from some iteration of Treasure Island or something inspired by it directly.
What drew you to want to study this and pursue this while you were earning your PhD and beyond?
So I got interested in piracy when I was doing my master's, and I got interested because I was taking a course on Atlantic history, which really kind of married my two favorite areas of history, colonial America and early modern Britain. And this was an area that I really wanted. I couldn't decide what area, but then Atlantic history covered everything, colonization and these interactions. And we read a book called Villains of All Nations by Marcus Rediker. And this is about piracy in the Atlantic world, the golden age of piracy, and how pirates lived and how they were essentially treated as terrorists. And so pirates used terror to get back at British authorities. And I found this really interesting because all I knew about pirates was from like the movie Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, kind of what we all thought. And so I really much wondered, how did we get from these pirates in Marcus Rediker's book to Jack Sparrow? And so that kind of set off my interest because I've always loved kind of a combination of pop culture and history. I do think pop culture complements history in a lot of positive ways. And for my PhD, I wanted to kind of continue this research. And I kind of learned that a pirate named Captain Kidd through my readings was executed at a place called Execution Dock in East London in a neighborhood called Wapping. And I wondered why he'd been taken to a different place than most criminals who were taken to the Tyburn Tree in West London. And no one had actually written about it. And so I decided to. I have always kind of been interested in sort of like darker side of history. And so going into an idea of kind of criminality and public executions and kind of, using piracy as the lens for it. So piracy was my lens into kind of studying the politics and the social effects of public executions. And that's kind of really been my research ever since.
That's great. I know a few people who have reached out to me and said this is an amazing subject, and they've actually asked the question: is anything known of like pirate records or things like that? Because they're thinking of the archival procedure of what you do. Is there something to that effect in these archival holdings that you find, or is it tucked away, or is it destroyed over time? What is going on with something concerning a pirate record?
Pirate records are complicated because most pirates didn't keep records themselves. The vast majority of pirate records that we have seen are kind of on the periphery, meaning that they're written by survivors of pirate attacks, government officials who are trying to stop piracy, letters between governors and and Parliament and those kind of in charge of colonial relationships, newspaper articles, but the best sources really are pirate trial transcripts, because that's where you're getting direct communication from pirates themselves, their own deposition. And you really learn a lot about life on the pirate ship because of this, and the crimes they committed or allegedly committed in some cases, and reasons why people turn to piracy. And also the public execution records are very good, because pirates were usually required to give a speech to an audience. This was very much part of the public execution ritual. It was theater pretty much for everyone across the board. So you get a lot more information. And there were some pirates that kind of left some records. Usually they were letters that they might have been sending to family members or to some other officials, but those are very, very rare. Either pirates chose not to keep records, or maybe they were destroyed, or maybe, just like so many other pieces of history, were just lost. The High Court of Admiralty records are also a huge treasure trove for piracy, because they were in charge of all things maritime in terms of the law, the High Court of Admiralty. Lots of papers about piracy in there. And the Calendar of State Papers, the colonial series in particular, that one has loads about pirates happening from the late 1600s up until the mid 1700s. So those are all the brilliant sources. But those of us who study piracy, we're looking at the same sources for the most part. So we're all kind of taking a lot of different interpretations, which is really interesting because we have a dialogue, which I love.
Right. It's part of being a historian, is where we look at primary sources or something to that effect, and we're like, wow, what does this actually say to us? And sometimes you come up with 2 or 3 different ways of looking at a particular document, which causes us to have some fun over a cup of coffee or something along the way. When you first open the book, you talk about the history of female piracy, or piracy in general, before Anne and Mary. And I think that's a amazing way to open it, because some people just think Anne and Mary were the first. What is the history in a very condensed version of kind of this female equivalency of piracy behind the times, or before the times of Mary and Anne?
So it's really interesting. What's a really interesting contrast between the female pirates who came before Mary and Anne is that a lot of women who did participate in piracy, going from the ancient world, such as Teuta of Illyria, up until not too long before Anne and Mary with Grace O'Malley in the late 1500s, a lot of those female pirates came from positions of power. Usually they themselves were a queen, or they were married to a royal governor, such as Saida al-Hurra out of Morocco in the 1500s. Grace O'Malley was married to a few different clan chieftains over her life. And so with these positions of power, they were able to command ships, usually specifically to attack other people in particular. So this type of piracy is actually quite different. They're almost kind of like hiring privateers, which are pirates for hire, basically, like mercenaries. And so this is where the history is actually quite complicated, because we also have to look at the sources where they come from. Most historical sources very much came from those male officials in particular, and they're not painting these women in positive lights at all. So we have to take that very much in consideration. Teuta of Illyria, who was Greek, a lot of the stuff about her was written by Roman historians who hated the Greeks and hated women in particular. Saida al-Hurra, a lot of information about her was written by the Spanish, and she was attacking Spanish ships. So we have to take that into account. But it's very much now what this does tell us, though, is that women have always participated in the maritime world in different ways. We just don't know very much about it, because they were definitely the minority in this, and the records are few and far between. But what's really interesting is just kind of showing this contrast. And Bonny and Mary Read did not come from positions of power at all whatsoever. They were very most likely working class women who were somehow able to enter that world. And that's what makes them so unique compared to almost all other known female pirates.
That's an amazing point, is that a lot of others are coming from those higher elite statuses, and they have the ability to command ships, and because of their status. And then you have Anne and Mary, who are trying to get ahead in the world, so to speak, and rebel almost against the status quo. So it's almost like a Robin Hood kind of thing in a way, but with piracy in that regard.
Right.
uh, what are some of these preconceived notions about Anne and Mary that you have experienced through doing your research, where people have either asked you something and it's like that old mythology coming back into play, or it's something that maybe you went into this with in your mind, and it was changed in the course of the research process?
I would say the biggest misconception, and this probably will be controversial, is the idea that Anne Bonny and Mary Read were lovers.
Hmm.
And this has very much kind of become the main belief about them. And I get asked questions about this all the time as to whether or not the two of them were in a romantic relationship. And I did go into my research initially believing this because it was everything I had heard as well. And there is a lot of stuff written about them that very much puts forward this idea. Um, the reality is, what I discovered in my research is that a lot of the idea that the two of them were lovers, a lot of people think it comes from the book A General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson, a collection of pirate biographies published in 1724. Their story is very much fictionalized, almost completely. And in it, he kind of talks a bit about how Anne Bonny, who's married to Captain Jack Rackham, falls in love with a young sailor on their pirate ship, and then is disappointed to find that this sailor is actually a woman. And that's Mary Read.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people have taken this to kind of, over time, this has kind of turned into the idea that, oh, they became lovers. And Jack Rackham was very jealous of Mary Read until he also realized that she was a woman. But actually, if you do a close read of it, Mary Read, according in the General History of the Pirates, actually marries another pirate on the ship. And in reality, the two women, they were both married, they were both married to pirates on the ship, and also they were both pregnant at the stand when they were on trial. So they were also what's very interesting is I learned in my research that the actual real idea that the two of them were lovers wasn't a concept until the 20th century, with an article. I forget the author off the top of my head, but it was an article written by a feminist sociologist. Can't remember her name, unfortunately, but it was called Anne and Mary, They Killed Pricks. And this is where the idea, she was the one who put forth the idea that the two of them were lovers. And this is what has really taken off. But there's no record of this. There's no record that Mary Read ever disguised herself as a man. In fact, Governor Woodes Rogers of the Bahamas issued a proclamation for the arrest of Jack Rackham and the two women pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So everyone knew that there were two women, no one in disguise. They never disguised themselves. And the those who had been captured and taken hostages on the ship even said in their descriptions that when the pirates weren't fighting, Anne and Mary Read were wearing female clothing. They only wore male clothing during battle. So that is probably the biggest misconception. And people have asked me this all the time. People really try to pull me to say that were they at least bisexual? And I'm like, we can't know that. We'll never know that. Were they lovers? There's no evidence of it. And I'm not even trying to do any queer erasure. That does happen in history, particularly towards women. There's just no evidence whatsoever anywhere.
I remember I first posted the cover of your book on one of my sites. I'm on all these platforms. I can't remember which one it was, and I usually post one 2 or 3 at the same time. And one of the ladies who follows me said, "Why are their shirts always open when they're on a painting or on a book cover, or what's going on with this? Why does it always have to be like this?" And I wanted to get that out to the forefront as well when we're talking about them wearing men's clothes during battle. As we saw on your cover, they're in their men's attire, shirts open and such. And that's what started the conversation on my site. Why men's clothes, number one, and why would they wear their shirts open in that way? Do we believe?
So that image comes from one of the editions of A General History of the Pirates. And this has become the iconic image of the two of them, leading us all to very much believe that they did fight with their shirts open. And in fact, we don't actually know if they did. In all the trial records, they were described as having large breasts, but we don't actually know if their shirts were open or not. Now, this is most likely was done in this way to kind of really, I don't even want to say show their femininity. I think it was meant to be done in a negative light to kind of show just how uncouth they were as women, during the 18th century, definitely breaking every single gender norm, and definitely in a way trying to emasculate people, or emasculate men, as it was kind of presented in fiction and in writings at the time. So this is kind of, I believe this is kind of why they were always depicted with their shirts open, wasn't as a way to kind of show off their power as women, but to actually show off why they were wrong as women in general. It was done in the opposite light for the time in the 18th century, which is what we always need to remember, is that the reality is the way they were portrayed in the 18th century does not have the same meaning as the 21st century. And in terms of male clothing, again, this was for two reasons. One, they did wear male clothing in battle, and that's for practicality. And they did not shy away from battle. In fact, they were two of the most ruthless fighters of anything. But it's almost impossible to fight in a dress with a bodice and skirts. So it was for practicality reasons. But they were also portrayed as wearing men's clothing, again, as a way to show their deviance. To kind of, women wearing men's clothing was pretty much unheard of. Or if women did wear trousers, it was because they were probably of the lowest of the working classes, because that's how much they had to labor. So it was not to paint them in any sort of positive light. It was to basically emasculate them as much as possible, or basically to make them look as masculine as possible while also looking as deviant as possible.
Is this how they were seen in that era as well, from that standpoint, because of the gender norms that we've discussed in various ways on various live streams and such of the 18th century? Was this done early on to also kind of paint them as a rogue set of women, or was this done later?
This was I think their story was built up in that way later over time. Because in the 18th century, the only real record we have of them, we only have basically three records of them. One, the proclamation by Woodes Rogers, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. One newspaper article briefly discussing their arrest and death, or their arrest and their trial, and then the trial transcript. That is it in terms of actual primary sources. And then, of course, we have a general history of the pirates, but their story is very fictionalized. And so what I find interesting is that at the time, being two women arrested for piracy, they didn't really show up in newspapers. It wasn't actually documented very much, aside from the trial, which was printed and published, which was very standard for the time. It was a general history of the pirates that kind of built their story forward. And in fact, advertising would emphasize including the two female pirates, Mary Read and Anne Bonny. And this was a selling point, and to make the book a bestseller. And what's really interesting is the way that Anne Bonny and Mary Read are written in terms of their origin stories. The idea is Anne Bonny becomes a pirate out of love. She falls in love with a sailor at 16, runs away with him. Their marriage doesn't go well. She falls out of love with him, runs away with Captain Jack Rackham, a pirate who she falls in love with as well. And this kind of almost portrays her in a bit of a apologetic light. She did this because she fell in love. Right. This is a very feminine reason for her to go into piracy. Mary Read is very much painted as the woman who kept herself in disguise as a man, fought in the army, did get married and was widowed, then went back into her male disguise and had no other real motivation. So she's very much painted in almost the masculine light, the bad reason to go into piracy. And so this, in terms of in readership of how people actually saw them, that is very difficult to ascertain, because we don't actually have, at least I've never found any reviews much of a general history of the pirates. They've been documented so little in general in any historical document, including newspapers. So it's almost kind of like maybe because they were women, they were either deliberately trying not to give information about them to the public, or because they were women, just weren't seen as newsworthy and were an afterthought, and just not even worth mentioning.
What was piracy like in this part of the world in the 18th century? Was it a rampant thing that was considered, an epidemic at the time, or was it some one-offs trying to get ahead?
During the time they were pirates in the 1720s, so the 1710s and 20s was probably the most active time for piracy in the Atlantic. And they were, most of them were attacking ships at will, and pirates' motivation was to get wealthy very quickly. So they were always after either merchant ships or sometimes slave ships if they were powerful enough. such as the pirate Sam Bellamy, who managed to capture the French ship the Widow. And unfortunately, though, he would die in a freak storm just weeks later. But the vast majority were after merchant ships. And so what's interesting is that the merchants were the ones who were saying that pirates were detrimental to the economy and society, and they were causing colonists to work with them, and it was going to create mass instability. The government actually, they were responding. The High Court of Admiralty was given priority to really focus on piracy, but the Royal Navy itself didn't really have much interest in pirates. They didn't really go after pirates as much. They did, but they didn't pour very many resources into it. So it really kind of depended on the group. Overall, though, every group did see pirates as a problem. So that was very much acknowledged. Governors found them to be a problem. The Royal Navy did put some resources into it. The High Court of Admiralty had priority to go after them. The merchants were the most vocal about the problem. So they were seen as a big nuisance. But in terms of how detrimental they were, that really kind of depended on the group of who was actually being affected by the pirates.
What was life like for these women on board a ship, or even the men on board ship? Because these aren't large ships. We in the modern era think of like Carnival Cruise Lines, and this is you have all the great amenities, but the ships are very small compared to what we see even in the 19th century. What was life like on a ship in the early 18th century?
It was not easy. Ships were small. They were very cramped, people living in very close quarters. Sanitation, not always the best. Human waste was usually just, in buckets dumped over the side of the ship. Sometimes certain portholes were made for it. But again, you're going to have a lot of smells. It's very hot, especially below deck. And a lot of sailors were malnourished. And even pirates generally fared better in terms of their diet, because whenever they would rob a ship, about 50% of all the goods they were managed to steal, they would keep for themselves in terms of food and things to repair their ship. So pirates had better conditions in general because of this. But disease was rampant. Injury was a huge problem. So there was most deaths at sea was due to injury and infection. So that was always a huge risk. And it was a very risky business going out at sea. So those who did were people who really genuinely found that calling for it, or had no other option whatsoever. So it was very, very tough. I personally would never want to have to work on a ship. Some people ask, like, wouldn't you love to like be on a pirate ship? And I'm like, no way.
No.
So it was pretty tough. Pirate ships in a lot of ways were better because they were more egalitarian. They had very strict rules, known as the Articles, or what we call the Pirate Code. That was very real. And which is actually the subject of my third book coming out later this year, Life on the Pirate Ship, based on the Pirate Code. And they had equal distribution of goods. They could vote in their captain. If there was going to be a punishment, it had to be decided by unanimous vote. Whereas on merchant ships or Royal Navy ships, people did not really have much control, not very much say. They would have wages withheld quite often. So life was better on a pirate ship in that sense. But in general, nasty business.
Is that what drew people sometimes to become pirates in general, is because they may have served, let's say, in the Royal Navy or something to that effect, and then they see how, quote, good some of these pirates have it, because they get to keep certain things and they get to live this life where they're not being ordered around by someone, let's say in London, and they have no idea what's going on in the Caribbean. It's kind of like a detachment from the hierarchy. Does that draw some people into piracy, including Anne and Mary?
Absolutely. That was probably the largest draw for people going into piracy, was better conditions and more freedom, because the pirates could make these collective decisions, get better pay. They knew the risk going in. The average pirate usually was only a pirate for 2 years, either because they were lucky enough to retire, which was very rare, or because they were captured, or because they were killed in battle. But a lot of people still, despite that risk, actively chose piracy for this. A lot of people were forced into piracy, or so they would claim. Most pirates at their trial would claim that they were forced into it. But there were people who were happy to join a pirate ship rather than become held hostage. They were happy to join it for these conditions and various other reasons. But yes, better life than a merchant ship or Royal Navy ship was absolutely probably the main motivator. In
Mhm.
terms of women like Bonny and Mary Read, it's very possible that life on a pirate ship, since they were active participants on the ship and not perhaps kind of held below deck or not allowed to do anything, this would be attractive to women because this would be kind of the one area where they would have complete, like a lot of their own agency, or if not agency, they weren't necessarily tied down into being either working in domestic service or becoming a wife and mother. That was basically the only choices for women. And, or if they were in a different situation, going into prostitution. Um, so women had very few options. A pirate ship did offer a lot more freedom. They were able to travel, they were able to fight. A lot of working class women were very strong. It's very labor intensive to manage to work a household and do all that heavy work. So working class women were quite suited for the rigors of a pirate ship. So it would offer women a type of freedom that they couldn't get otherwise.
You talk in the book about how I won't give it all away because I want people to read the book, but you talk in there about going into on trial and how pirates are executed and such. What would a trial and possible execution look like compared to what we see in the movies? Let's say.
So what's different about pirate trials is that pirates, so even even in the early modern period, people were innocent until proven guilty at a trial, except for pirates and
Hmm.
other major crimes. They were assumed guilty unless proven innocent.
Wow.
So in a lot of ways, pirate trials were like mostly show trials because legally everyone had to have a trial. And the evidence would, so it would kind of start out with very long depositions by the lawyers. There were pretty much only prosecutors, no defense lawyers at all whatsoever. And so they would kind of read a whole litany of what the laws against piracy were and what crimes they committed. And then witnesses were brought forward to speak out against pirates. If a pirate was lucky enough to get someone to serve as a character witness, then that could help them perhaps get off in terms of, you know, being let go, being found innocent. But that was very rare. A lot of people did not want to be associated with pirates.
Hmm.
And so people would generally go in and they'd be kind of like an exciting fair because people knew that this was a chance to learn about pirates, but also because everyone knew that most likely it would turn out that they would get a guilty verdict. And that was always more exciting than a not guilty verdict. Pirates were allowed to speak for themselves, and many did, but it never really helped them. And then some pirates refused at all to speak out for themselves, either because they were stubborn and, were just spiting them, or because they knew that there was nothing they could do or say, or they would very much really give in as many details as possible, trying to prove their innocence, basically throwing their fellow crew members under the bus whenever possible to see if that could help get them off. So yeah, it was very much kind of a show trial. It would not be seen as a fair trial like we'd see today. Maybe we do see in movies and TV shows a trial that ends up being very sensationalized, very big deal.
Right.
But you're not going to be seeing what we'd expect in a trial. It's not a fair trial. It's not an innocent until proven guilty situation at all. It's just basically there to condemn a pirate. That's the entire point.
Was it usually also an automatic death sentence if found guilty, or were there like life imprisonments or anything like that?
It was pretty much an automatic death sentence if found guilty. And this was done by public hanging.
Mm.
And they were traditionally, a lot of people, when they were hanged, were usually taken to like the scene of the crime or a place that symbolized the crime, which is why in London, a lot of pirates were shipped back to London, thrown into Newgate Prison, put on trial in the High Court of Admiralty, and then taken to Execution Dock, which is on the Thames in East London. So to symbolize that their crime took place on a body of water. And also, since it was the High Court of Admiralty in charge of prosecuting piracy, they were only in charge of crimes that took place in the water. So the execution had to take place at a place of water. So they were always kind of taken to those sorts of places. And people would come, by the hundreds, and to watch this whole thing, you'd have someone, either the ordinary of Newgate, the spiritual advisor, or some sort of minister like Cotton Mather in colonial America, who would try to get the pirates to repent or speak out against them spiritually, and how they've rejected the church, et cetera, et cetera. Then you would have their crimes read aloud. And then the pirates were required to give a speech, which is where they would basically admit their crimes, atone for their crimes, and try to warn anyone against going into that way of life. And then the hanging would happen. And that was always the most exciting part. That's what people were really there for.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like a fair atmosphere sometimes, or a carnival atmosphere when you read some of the documents. It's like everybody in town or in that neighborhood shows up to
Hmm.
see this and to witness it, to say they were there when it
Hmm.
occurs. It's quite a strange thing for us to think about, as we still to this day talk about capital punishment and is it the right thing to do or not. And thinking about people coming out to witness this is
Hmm.
quite an interesting thing. As you were going through the process of researching, Rebecca, were there either one of these women? Was your mindset changed on them, or did you get a new idea of who they were compared to when you went into it, or maybe a not a kinship because you're not going to go into piracy, I hope. But like you were like, wow, I can understand why someone would want to get out of this situation, or something to this effect.
Yeah, my mindset really did change quite a bit. And a lot of it wasn't necessarily because I was researching them in particular. It was because I was really diving into, no pun intended, into a whole new field that I didn't really experience much, into women's history and gender. Um, I did not have much experience in that at all. So I was learning lots of new theory, and it gave me a whole new understanding of what the lives of women were like during the 16 and 1700s, and what the maritime world would be for them, kind of comparing and contrasting, the male experience versus the female experience. And so this was able to help me really put them into a whole new perspective for myself. They weren't just kind of like these women going against the grain. It was just showing the realities of like women often had no other choice, or had no choices in their lives. And they were very unusual, but they were not trying to be what we would think of as feminist icons. Just like anybody else, they were going into it wanting to have their own life and be successful in their own way. Um, and yeah, so I think it was really kind of researching a lot of women's history, which I just hadn't done before, that like really, really enriched my own study of what their lives could have been like. A lot of my book is, again, not to give too much away, but a lot of my book is speculation because we know so little about their early lives. The only information we have about the early life comes from a general history of the pirates, and it's pretty much all fictionalized. So for that is where I had to really go into women's history and provide the context. If their situations were true, this is what it would be like for women. And that is what really kind of helped sort of shape my understanding of what women's lives were like during that time period.
How do you think stories like this that are brought down through generations and are being showcased in new ways thanks to your work and I'm sure others to come in the future, how do you think that's influencing our perspective from a popular culture standpoint? Because we're seeing, Pirates of the Caribbean and we're seeing all the Black Flag stuff or Black Sail, excuse me, stuff. How do you think that influences how we see it from a popular culture standpoint?
What I'm always hoping is I'm trying to show that pirates were way more nuanced and complicated than we think. Um, it wasn't just that they were these major swashbucklers, or they weren't just these evil criminals out for blood. In fact, very few pirates were actually that violent. They wanted to get in and out and as quick as possible with as few little death as possible, because it would hurt them just as much as the other ship. And if they got caught, they could try to at least say, hey, I didn't murder anyone. So that's what I kind of try to show. And what I always hope is that people just kind of gain a deeper understanding of pirates, that they aren't just simply these Jack Sparrow types of characters that we might think. And actually, you mentioned Black Sails. That is actually my absolute favorite depiction of piracy I've ever seen in
Really?
fiction. I love it because I do think it shows this nuance a lot better than anything else. Because not to give too much away from the show, you don't just see them being these like pirates at the sea. You see them on land, the politics behind what they need to do, funding that they need to get, who's helping them, who's not, what is the actual state of piracy, what is this culture, what are the reasons people go into piracy. You see this nuance. It's not done perfectly, but you see this nuance done more than any other piece of fiction. So that's why when people ask like, what is like a cool movie or show I could watch, I always say Black Sails for this exact reason.
Really? That's what I was going to ask next. What was your pick for what we have to watch from a popular culture standpoint? So you've crossed that bridge and given it to us. That's fantastic. And uh, you said about your next book coming out about the codes. I'd love to get a little sneak peek into your research on that, as far as your research methods or what you're going to be looking into with that, so people understand what is next for you and for this kind of trilogy of piracy that you're coming up with here.
Sure. So then my next book is called The Pirate Code: Laws and Life Aboard Ship. And it comes out in June, I believe, of 2023 and or of this year.
Right.
That's right. It's
Yes,
2023
yeah,
now.
yes. Time flies.
And what I basically have done is that I'm, kind of what the title says is I'm looking at what life was like on the pirate ship. And I'm basing this on the pirate articles or the pirate code. And there were several that we know of, like at least 4 from different pirates that actually are documented. And they're very similar. Like one code about the distribution of goods, how that was done, putting out punishments, sexual relationships on the ship, like some pirates saying absolutely no women on board ship, no boys on ship, no lewd behavior on land, to the point of like even just being like no gambling, no snapping your weapons in the hold. So all about this. And so food and drink, how to allocate it. So it was very specific. And so what I did is I organized my book in chapters kind of based on each one of these codes. So I wrote a chapter about how the distributions of goods and wages were implemented. What were punishments like, either for pirates or their hostages? And, what are battle tactics and weapons that they used? What was food and drink like on a standard pirate ship? And medicine and illness and injury, sexual relationships, vices, and then entertainment, that sort of stuff. And so that book it's funny in a way. It wasn't as complicated as Pirate Queens. Pirate Queens is a very difficult book to write. So I had to reconstruct so much missing history. This one, not as much, but I really feel like it deepened my understanding into piracy more than anything else I've researched, because I was going into so many, going right back into all these primary sources I had looked at. And I was looking through pirate trials. I was really going through things with a fine-tooth comb. Any mention of goods, any mention of food, any mention, that sort of stuff, I'd pull out, put into notes for a different chapter. There was really, really amazing website called The Pirate Surgeon that I used quite a bit, because I forget the name of the person who has it, who updates it, but it's brilliantly researched with such a vast wealth of information. So I would cite a lot of those articles or go into the primary sources that the author would use to go into it in a bit wider. So that was kind of how I organized my book. And this is actually probably my favorite of the ones I've written. I feel like this is where I did my best job. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's being published by Reaction Books. So a small press based in the UK, and it'll get published in the US as well. So, but yeah, that comes out. I think it's also my longest book, actually. But
Really?
yeah, but this one I think was is the one I'm the most proud of. So I'm looking forward to it coming out.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. I'm glad to see that this is progressing in this direction, because sometimes it might be better for some people to read about the codes first before they go and check out some other stuff on the market and understand what is going on in the book, and understand what the foundational aspect of piracy is in the 18th century and previously. And I want to thank you, Rebecca, for coming on and discussing this with me, and discussing the book, and just being a part of the conversation about this topic and more, because I know that there are some fields where we're crossing over into gender norms, and when we're talking about capture slave ships, we're talking about race and other things. So there's a big interdisciplinary focus when you really dive into it, and I appreciate your words on that.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I've had a lot of fun.
You're very